He barely opened textbooks. While his classmates pulled all-nighters in the MIT library, surrounded by towers of notes and highlighted pages, Richard Feynman was playing bongo drums in a jazz bar. He'd show up to lectures late, sometimes not at all. His study group? He didn't have one. And when the Putnam exam landed on his desk, the exam that made valedictorians cry and reduced straight-A students to the puddles of self-doubt, Feynman finished in half the time with a perfect score. His classmates, the ones who'd sacrificed sleep and sanity, who'd memorized every formula and filled notebooks with practice problems, most of them failed. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Not with Feynman, with everything they believed about learning. This comes directly from Feynman's own accounts in Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, and verified stories from his years at MIT and Princeton. The details that follow aren't motivational myths. They're documented patterns from one of the 20th century's greatest physicists. What Feynman discovered about learning at 19 would take cognitive scientists 4 decades to prove. But he knew at the moment he noticed something strange about the students around him. MIT in 1936. The physics building at 2 in the morning. A dozen students hunched over problem sets, their eyes bloodshot, their hands cramping from hours of calculations. They'd been there since dinner, some had been there since lunch, and they were stuck, genuinely, desperately stuck, on a problem their professor had assigned that morning. Enter Feynman, strolling in around 2 a.m. after a date, whistling something off-key. He glanced at the blackboard where they had written the problem. 30 seconds of silence. Then, "Oh, that's just..." And he walked to the board, wrote out the solution in 4 lines, and walked out. The whole interaction took maybe 90 seconds. The students stared at the board, then at each other. Then one of them, a guy named Welton who'd spent 6 hours on that problem, said what they were all thinking. How is that possible? They concluded Feynman was a genius, a freak of nature, someone born with a brain that worked differently. They were wrong, but they wouldn't realize how wrong until much later. Because what looked like effortless brilliance was actually something else entirely, something that made Feynman uncomfortable when he first noticed it in himself. Here's what actually happened that night. Feynman had seen a similar problem 2 years earlier. Not the same problem, similar. And back then, when he'd first encountered that type of physics problem, he'd spent hours not solving it, but understanding it. He'd drawn pictures. He'd made up a story about balls rolling down hills. He'd explained it to his younger sister using oranges and a ramp made from a textbook. He'd broken it down until a 12-year-old could grasp the core concept. And now, 2 years later, when a variation of that problem appeared, his brain didn't have to work hard. The pattern was already there, built into his intuition. But what nobody knew, including Feynman himself at first, was that his laziness was actually the most effective learning technique ever documented. He just thought he was being efficient. The real revelation came during a quantum mechanics lecture in his junior year. Professor Morse was explaining something called the Dirac equation, one of the most beautiful and confusing pieces of physics ever written. Feynman copied the equations into his notebook like everyone else. He followed the mathematical steps, and at the end of the lecture, he understood nothing, not a single conceptual thing. He could manipulate the symbols, sure. He could plug numbers into the formula. But if someone asked him what the equation actually meant, what it was saying about reality, he had no answer. This moment, this specific moment of confusion, was where most students shrug and move on. The exam only asks you to use the formula, not understand it. So, why waste time? But Feynman felt something else. Excitement. Because he'd just caught himself doing the thing he hated most, pretending to understand something he didn't. That night, he went back to his dorm and did something strange. He took out a blank piece of paper and tried to explain the Dirac equation to an imaginary freshman who'd never taken quantum mechanics. He got about 2 sentences in before he hit a wall. He didn't understand what spinor meant. Not really. He'd memorized the definition, a mathematical object that transforms in a particular way under rotation. But that was just words. He couldn't visualize it. He couldn't explain why it mattered, so he backed up. Way up, he started with, okay, what's an electron? And then, what do we mean by spin? And then, why do we need this mathematical machinery in the first place? Each time he hit something he couldn't explain simply, he'd stop and wrestle with it until he could. This took him 8 hours, for one equation. His roommate thought he was losing his mind, but something happened during those 8 hours. When Feynman finally understood the Dirac equation well enough to explain it simply, he noticed he'd learned 5 other things he hadn't intended to learn. The foundations he had had to rebuild to understand spine errors gave him insight into problems he hadn't even encountered yet. It was like strengthening a muscle you didn't know you had. Suddenly, other movements became easier too. But this created a problem Feynman didn't expect, because once you know what real understanding feels like, you can't unknow it. And most of his education, most of everyone's education, suddenly felt hollow. He started noticing it everywhere. Lectures where professors defined terms using other undefined terms, creating circular nonsense that sounded profound but meant nothing. Textbooks that presented formulas without derivation, expecting students to memorize the result and move on. Study groups where people quizzed each other on facts without ever asking, but why is that true? And worst of all, classmates who could ace exams while having zero intuition for the actual physics. There was a guy in Feynman's differential equations class who could solve any problem the professor assigned. Any problem. He had perfect technique, perfect notation, perfect grades. Feynman asked him one day, "What do you think a differential equation actually is? Like, what's it doing?" The guy stared at him. "It's a relationship between a function and its derivatives." He was quoting the textbook definition verbatim. Feynman pushed, "Okay, but what does that mean? What's it modeling?" Silence. Then, "Why does that matter? We just need to solve them." That conversation haunted Feynman, because this guy wasn't stupid. He was technically brilliant, but he'd learned a trick without learning the thing. He could perform physics without understanding physics. And the terrifying part? The education system rewarded him for it. Perfect grades, scholarship offers, professorships in his future. Meanwhile, Feynman, who spent half his time staring at walls trying to visualize what equations actually meant, was considered lazy by some of his professors. And then something happened that almost derailed everything. A professor called him out in class. Feynman had missed the previous 3 lectures because he was stuck on a single concept from 2 weeks ago. Something about tensor notation that didn't make sense. The professor, irritated, asked him to solve a problem on the board. It involved the exact notation Feynman had been wrestling with. He walked to the board, stared at it for a moment, then said, "I can't do this." The room went silent. Someone whispered, "Feynman can't do it?" The professor, sensing an opportunity to make an example, said, "Perhaps if you'd attended the lectures, Mr. Feynman." But then Feynman said something that changed the temperature in the room. "No, I can't do this because I don't understand what this notation means. And I don't think anyone else here does either. We've just memorized the procedure." He turned to face the class. "Can anyone explain what this symbol represents? Not the definition from the book. Explain it like you'd explain it to your little sister." Silence. 20 students, all of whom could solve tensor problems in their sleep, and not one could explain what they were actually doing. The professor noticed, and he wasn't happy. But he also wasn't stupid. After class, he pulled Feynman aside and said something Feynman never forgot. "You're either going to fail or change physics. There's no middle ground with your approach." The professors were right to worry, because Feynman's approach was about to produce results that shouldn't have been possible. Senior year, the Putnam exam. If you don't know this test, imagine the hardest math problems you've ever seen. Multiply the difficulty by 10, and then give students 3 hours to solve them. The median score is usually 0 or 1 out of 100 points. Getting 20 points makes you a campus legend. Feynman scored a perfect 100 and finished in 90 minutes. His classmates were devastated, not because he beat them, they expected that, but because of what he did after finishing. He walked around the exam room, looked at what other students were working on, and started explaining where they'd gone wrong during the exam. The proctors had to stop him, because technically it was against the rules, but the damage was done. Students who'd spent the entire semester memorizing techniques realized those techniques were useless if you didn't understand the underlying structure. And Feynman understood structure better than anyone they'd ever met. But here's what's strange. Feynman didn't think he was doing anything special. Years later, in an interview, he'd say, "I just refuse to fool myself. That's all. Most people learn to pretend they understand things. I never learned that skill. This wasn't about being smart. This was about being honest, brutally, almost painfully honest, about what you actually understand versus what you've memorized. And that honesty? It's the one thing most learners refuse to have. The pattern repeated at Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project. Feynman arrived knowing almost nothing about the specific nuclear physics required for bomb design. The other physicists, Oppenheimer, Bethe, Fermi, were already experts. Feynman was assigned to a computational group, basically doing grunt work. Within 3 months, he was leading theoretical discussions with Bohr. Within 6 months, Oppenheimer was assigning him problems that senior physicists had been stuck on for weeks. The transformation happened so fast, it made people suspicious. Was Feynman hiding previous knowledge? Was he a savant? Neither. He'd simply done the thing he always did, refused to pretend. When he didn't understand something in a meeting, he'd interrupt. Wait, what do you mean by that? Senior scientists would sometimes bristle. Didn't this kid know basic nuclear physics? But Feynman didn't care about looking smart. He cared about actually understanding. And his questions, the ones that seemed naive at first, often revealed that nobody in the room fully understood what they were talking about. They'd just gotten comfortable with the jargon. Hans Bethe, who became Feynman's mentor at Los Alamos, later said, "I learned more physics from explaining things to Feynman than I learned from any textbook, because he'd ask why about things I'd stopped asking why about decades ago." Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because Feynman's method exposes something most people spend their entire education hiding: the difference between performing knowledge and possessing knowledge. You've felt this. That moment in a meeting when someone asks you to explain something you thought you knew, and suddenly your mind goes blank. Or that exam where you'd memorized every formula but couldn't solve a problem that was slightly different from the practice problems. Or that course you took where you got an A, and 2 months later, you couldn't remember a single concept. This isn't because you're stupid. This is because you were taught by people who didn't know how learning actually works. They taught you to optimize for grades, for certificates, for the appearance of knowledge. And appearance is easy to fake. Understanding is not. Feynman would have diagnosed you in 30 seconds. He'd have asked you to explain something you claim to know, and within 2 minutes, you'd hit a wall. A concept you can't define. A principle you can't derive, a connection you assumed but can't justify. And right there, at that wall, is where learning actually begins. But most people never stay at the wall long enough. They see confusion as failure, as evidence they're not smart enough, so they paper over it with memorization and move on. Feynman saw confusion as an invitation, as a sign that something interesting was hiding there. He'd later codify this into what teachers now call the Feynman technique, though he never called it that. The method is simple. Take something you think you understand and try to explain it to a child. Not a college student, not even a high school student, a child. And when you hit something you can't explain simply, and you will hit it, that's your gap. That's where you don't actually understand. So, you back up, rebuild your foundation, and try again. But here's the thing nobody talks about. This method is uncomfortable. It's slow. It makes you feel stupid, at least at first. Which is why most people don't do it. They'd rather feel smart while learning nothing than feel confused while learning everything. The education system makes this worse, because everything about how we structure learning is designed to hide confusion, not expose it. Lectures present clean narratives that skip over the messy parts. Textbooks show finished solutions without the 20 failed attempts. Exams test recall, not understanding. So students learn to play the game, memorize, regurgitate, forget, repeat. And then they wonder why nothing sticks, why they can pass tests but can't apply anything, why they feel like frauds in their own careers. Feynman watched this pattern for decades, and it broke his heart. He'd be invited to review textbooks for California schools, and he'd find books that were hundreds of pages of definitions with zero understanding. He'd visit physics departments and find graduate students who could derive quantum field equations but couldn't explain what a field was. He'd talk to CEOs who'd paid fortunes for executive education but couldn't explain the core concepts of their own businesses. In 1974, giving a commencement address at Caltech, he told graduating students, "The first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool." He was talking about scientific integrity, but he was also talking about learning. Because every time you pretend to understand something you don't, every time you highlight a passage without thinking about it, every time you memorize a formula without deriving it, you're fooling yourself. And that self-deception compounds. It becomes a habit. Until one day you realize you've spent years learning things you don't actually know. This isn't just about exams. This is about your career, your confidence. The quiet voice that wonders if you're actually competent or just good at pretending. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Most professionals are faking it, not because they're lazy or stupid, but because they were taught to fake it. They learned to speak the language of their field without understanding the grammar. They learned to recognize patterns without understanding the principles. And as long as nobody asks them to explain from first principles, they get away with it. Until they don't. Until they're in a meeting and someone asks a basic question they can't answer. Until they're managing a team and realize they don't actually understand the work they're managing. Until they're stuck in their career because they never built real foundations, just memorized enough to pass the last test. Feynman's gift wasn't his intelligence. Plenty of people at MIT were as smart as him. His gift was permission to feel confused, to ask stupid questions, to admit ignorance, to rebuild understanding from scratch, even when it takes 8 hours for one equation. Most people never give themselves that permission. They think confusion is failure. Feynman knew confusion was the only honest starting point. He'd say in later interviews, "I don't know what's the matter with people. They don't learn by understanding. They learn by some other way, by rote or something. Their knowledge is so fragile." He wasn't being arrogant. He was genuinely confused by why people chose the hard path. Memorization, cramming, surface-level learning that evaporates in weeks when the easier path was right there. Build understanding once, deeply, and it becomes intuition. You can't forget intuition. You can't lose it under pressure. It becomes part of how you see the world. But that path requires something most people aren't willing to give: temporary humility. You have to be willing to feel stupid for a few hours, to rebuild concepts you thought you already knew, to question assumptions everyone else has accepted. And in a world that rewards confidence over competence, that temporary humility feels like weakness. It's not weakness, it's the only path to actual strength. Late in his life, Feynman received a letter from a young physics student who was struggling. The student wrote, "Everyone else seems to get this easily. I have to work so hard just to keep up. Maybe I'm not cut out for physics." Feynman's response: "Study hard what interests you the most, in the most undisciplined, irreverent, and original manner possible." Translation: stop trying to learn like everyone else. Stop optimizing for grades or approval. Stop pretending to understand what you don't. Learn for real, even if it's messy and slow and makes you look foolish. Because here's what Feynman understood that most people miss. Struggle isn't learning. Struggle is a signal, a flashing warning light that says you're taking the wrong approach. Real learning, the kind that builds intuition and lasts forever, doesn't feel like struggle. It feels like clarity arriving in waves, like pieces clicking into place, like suddenly seeing a pattern you couldn't see before. When Feynman worked on a problem he truly understood, it didn't feel like work. It felt like play, like exploring, like discovering something that was always there but hidden. The struggle came before that. During the foundation building, the question asking, the confusion embracing. But once the foundation was there, the actual learning felt almost effortless. That's the metric most people miss. If learning consistently feels like punishment, like grinding through content you don't understand to get a grade you don't care about, you're doing it wrong. Not morally wrong, strategically wrong. You're choosing the path that works least well, that produces knowledge that evaporates fastest, that builds confidence on sand instead of stone. Feynman proved you can learn faster, better, and with more enjoyment by doing the one thing most education systems punish: being honest about what you don't know. But Feynman's learning method was only half of his secret. The other half, the one he rarely talked about, and that changed everything about how he approached physics, had to do with how he chose what to learn in the first place. Because while everyone else was racing to study the trending topics and impress the famous professors, Feynman was following a completely different compass. And that compass led him to questions nobody else thought were worth asking, questions that later revolutionized entire fields. But to understand that choice, we need to look at what happened the summer after Los Alamos, when Feynman almost quit physics entirely.
Here's something curious. Watch a 3-year-old for an hour. They ask why about everything. Why is the sky blue? Why do birds fly? Why does water make things wet? They're not studying. They're not preparing for a test. They're just interested. They want to know how things work. Now watch an adult trying to learn something new. Maybe they're reading a textbook, or watching an educational video, or sitting in a training session. Notice something? Often there's this look, a kind of tension. The jaw is set. The focus is intense, but not in a joyful way. It's the focus of someone doing something difficult, something they have to get through. What happened between age 3 and age 30? Because here's the thing. The human brain is actually built for learning. It's what it does best. Every moment it's taking in information, making connections, building patterns. You learn to recognize your mother's face. You learned language, one of the most complex systems humans have ever created, before you could even tie your shoes. You figured out how to walk, which requires calculating thousands of tiny muscle movements and balance adjustments, and you did it without a manual. So if learning is natural, if it's something the brain does automatically, why does it feel so hard? Why do so many people say they hate learning? The answer is simple. They don't hate learning. They hate something else that's been disguised as learning. Think about what happens when you're genuinely curious about something. Let's say you're trying to figure out why your car is making a strange noise. You're not following a curriculum. You're not memorizing facts. You're investigating. You listen carefully to the sound. You think about what parts of the car could create that noise. Maybe you look under the hood. You might ask someone who knows about engines. You might read something online. But notice, you are pulling information toward yourself. You have a question and you want an answer. This is learning in its natural form. It starts with curiosity, with not knowing something and wanting to know it. The wanting part is crucial. The brain is designed to find satisfaction in figuring things out. There's actually a small chemical reward every time you make a connection, every time something clicks into place. It's the same system that makes puzzles satisfying to solve, that makes mysteries compelling to read. But now think about typical education. Someone else decides what you should learn. They decide when you should learn it. They break it down into pieces and give you piece number 1, whether you're curious about it or not. Then they test you to see if you retain piece number 1 before moving you to piece number 2. The sequence is fixed. The pace is fixed. The material is fixed. And here's what's crucial. The questions aren't yours. When you learn something because someone told you that you need to know it, something fundamental changes. The brain's natural curiosity mechanism isn't engaged. Instead, you're using a different system, the one related to obligation, to avoiding negative consequences, to doing what you're supposed to do. This system works to some extent. People can force themselves to memorize things, to study things they don't care about. But it's effortful, it's draining, and the information doesn't stick the same way. There's a simple test for this. Think back to school. Now, try to remember the quadratic formula, or the date of some historical treaty you had to memorize, or the definition of mitosis versus meiosis. For most people, this information is gone. Not because their memory is bad, but because they never really learned it. They temporarily stored it just long enough to pass a test, and then the brain quite sensibly threw it away. Why would it keep information that has no connection to anything, that answers no question you actually have? Now think about something you learned because you wanted to know it. Maybe it's how to play a song on an instrument, or the rules of a game you enjoy, or how to cook a specific dish, or the details of a historical event you found fascinating. That information is still there, isn't it? Even years later. Because when you learned it, you were actually learning, not just storing facts temporarily. The difference isn't in the subject matter. It's in the relationship between the person and the information. Here's an analogy that might help. Imagine you're hungry, and someone makes you food you actually want to eat. Maybe it's your favorite dish. You eat it, you enjoy it, your body processes it, and you're nourished. Now imagine someone forces you to eat something you find disgusting. You might be able to choke it down, but it's unpleasant, and your body might even reject it. Same basic process eating, but completely different experiences. Learning works the same way. When the brain wants information, when there's genuine curiosity, it absorbs that information easily. The neural pathways are ready. There's attention, not forced attention, but natural attention, the kind that happens when you're interested. When the brain doesn't want the information, when it's being forced in, everything is harder. Attention drifts, retention is poor, understanding is shallow. So what makes the difference? What creates genuine curiosity? The answer is surprisingly simple. Questions. Real learning starts with a question. Not a question someone else asked you, but a question you actually have. Why does that work that way? What would happen if? How does this connect to that? The question creates a kind of tension in the mind. You know there's an answer, and you want to resolve the tension by finding it. This is why children learn so effortlessly. They're full of questions. Everything is new, so everything prompts a why or a how. They haven't learned to suppress their curiosity yet. They haven't learned that asking questions might make them look stupid, or that some questions aren't worth asking, or that they should just memorize what they're told. Adults still have this capacity. It's not gone, but it gets buried under years of being told what to learn and how to learn it. Many people have been trained quite thoroughly to see learning as something that happens to them, not something they do for themselves. Watch what happens when an adult becomes genuinely interested in something. Maybe they decide they want to learn how to bake bread. Suddenly, they're researching flour types, understanding gluten development, experimenting with hydration ratios. They're watching videos, reading articles, trying things out. They might spend hours on this, and they don't experience it as studying. It's just interesting. They have questions, and they're finding answers. Or consider someone who gets interested in how something went wrong. A bridge collapsed, or a company failed, or a historical event unfolded in an unexpected way. If they're genuinely curious, they'll dig into it. They'll want to understand the mechanism, the chain of causes and effects. And in the process, they'll learn all sorts of things, engineering principles, economic factors, human psychology, without it feeling like work. The subject doesn't matter. What matters is whether there's a real question driving the learning. Now, here's where it gets interesting. You can actually cultivate this. You can learn how to learn in a way that's natural and enjoyable. It's not complicated, but it requires a shift in how you approach new information. First, start with what you're actually curious about, not with what you think you should learn. If you're interested in why certain movies are scary, that's a legitimate starting point. You might end up learning about psychology, about visual composition, about sound design, about pacing and narrative structure. All of that is real knowledge, but you got there through genuine interest, not through obligation. Second, follow your questions, not someone else's curriculum. Let's say you're curious about how airplanes fly. You might start with a simple explanation, but then you might wonder, what exactly is lift? That leads you to air pressure. Then maybe you wonder why air pressure works that way, which leads you to molecular motion. Or maybe you get curious about why wings are shaped the way they are, which leads you to fluid dynamics. Each answer creates new questions. This is natural. This is how understanding deepens. The traditional approach would be, here's chapter 1 on basic aerodynamics. Memorize these terms, take a quiz, then move to chapter 2. But that's backward. It starts with answers and hopes you'll develop questions. Natural learning starts with questions and pulls in answers. Third, use your own understanding, not memorization. When you're trying to learn something, the goal isn't to be able to repeat information. It's to understand it well enough that you can explain it in your own words, using your own analogies. If you can't do that, you don't really understand it yet, you've just memorized some words. This is actually a powerful test. Take any concept you think you understand and try to explain it to someone who knows nothing about it without using any jargon. If you can do that, you understand it. If you can't, you've identified where your understanding is shallow. That's not a failure, that's useful information. Now you know what question to ask next. 4, make connections. The brain doesn't store information in isolation. It stores it as part of a network. Every piece of information connects to other pieces. When you learn something new, actively think about how it relates to things you already know. Does it explain something you've observed? Does it contradict something you thought was true? Does it work the same way as something in a completely different domain? These connections are what make information stick. They're also what make learning enjoyable. There's real satisfaction in seeing how things fit together, and having those aha moments when you realize two different concepts are actually related. Fifth, accept confusion as part of the process. When you're genuinely learning something, there's always a period of not understanding. This is normal. It's not a sign that you're bad at learning or that the subject is too hard. It's just what happens when you encounter something new. The brain needs time to build the right mental structures. The problem is that traditional education punishes confusion. If you don't understand something quickly, you fall behind, you get poor grades, you feel stupid. So people learn to avoid confusion, to stick to things they already know, to never venture into genuine uncertainty. But real learning requires being comfortable with temporary confusion. It's the space between not knowing and knowing. You can't skip it. Here's what's fascinating. When you approach learning this way, starting with curiosity, following your questions, seeking understanding rather than memorization, it doesn't feel like work. It feels like play, like solving a puzzle, like exploring. And the information sticks, not because you drilled it into your memory, but because you understand it. Understanding is its own kind of memory. You don't have to remember Newton's third law. If you actually understand the principle, you can recreate it because it makes sense. This is why children learn so much so quickly. They're not studying. They're playing. They're experimenting. They're asking questions and finding answers. And they're doing it all day, every day, without it being exhausting, because their curiosity is engaged. The tragedy is that the educational system often trains this out of people. By the time someone is an adult, they might believe that learning is supposed to be hard, that it requires discipline and willpower, that some people are just good at learning and others aren't. But that's like saying some people are good at being hungry and others aren't. Everyone's brain wants to learn. That's what it does. The question is whether you're feeding it questions it actually wants answers to, or trying to force feed it information it has no use for. Think about the last time you fell down a rabbit hole online. You started looking up one thing, and 3 hours later you're reading about something completely different, having followed a chain of interesting connections. That's learning. Effortless, enjoyable learning. You weren't forcing yourself to pay attention. Attention happened naturally because you were curious. Now imagine if someone had handed you a textbook covering all those topics and told you to study it for a test. Same information, but completely different experience. The mechanism here is worth understanding. The human brain has limited resources for forced attention, for making yourself focus on something you're not interested in. This is willpower, and it depletes. After a few hours of forced study, you're exhausted. But curiosity-driven attention is different. It doesn't deplete the same way. You can follow your curiosity for hours and feel energized rather than drained. This has enormous implications. It means that the traditional approach to learning, forcing yourself through material you're not interested in, is not just unpleasant, it's inefficient. You're using the wrong mental mechanism. It's like trying to move a heavy object by pushing it uphill instead of rolling it downhill. Here's a useful thought experiment. Imagine you could learn anything you wanted, but you couldn't get a degree in it, it wouldn't help your career, and no one would ever test you on it. What would you choose to learn? Most people have immediate answers to this question. Oh, I'd love to understand quantum mechanics. I'd learn to play piano. I'd study the history of ancient Rome. I'd figure out how the brain works. There are all these things people are genuinely curious about, but they don't pursue them because they seem impractical, or because learning has become associated with obligation rather than curiosity. But here's the thing. The mechanism of learning is the same whether you're learning something practical or not. If you can reawaken that natural curiosity, if you can make learning feel like following your interests rather than fulfilling obligations, you'll learn practical things better too. Let's say you need to learn statistics for work. The traditional approach, get a textbook, start at chapter 1, force yourself through it. The curiosity approach, start with a question you actually have. Maybe you want to understand why polls are sometimes wrong, or how doctors determine if a treatment works, or what people mean when they say a result is statistically significant. Start there. Follow your genuine curiosity. You'll end up learning the statistics you need, but you'll understand it better because you pulled it in rather than having it pushed on you. This works for anything. You want to learn a language? Don't start with grammar drills. Start with something you're actually interested in, maybe a movie, or music, or articles about a topic you care about. You'll be confused at first, but you'll be motivated to figure out what's being said. Grammar will make sense because you have a context for it, a reason to care about the difference between this verb tense and that one. The principle is universal. Start with a real question, with genuine curiosity, and let that pull you into the learning. Now, there's an objection that comes up here. What about things you need to know but aren't naturally curious about? What about requirements, prerequisites, things you have to learn whether you're interested or not? This is a real issue, but it's often overstated. First, there's usually a way to connect required knowledge to something you are curious about. If you need to learn calculus, maybe you're not interested in derivatives as abstract concepts, but you might be interested in how things change over time, how a population grows, how a rocket accelerates, how medicine spreads through the body. Find that connection, and suddenly calculus is the tool that helps you understand something you care about. Second, even when you can't find that connection, understanding how learning actually works is useful. You can at least avoid the most inefficient approaches. Don't just read and reread the same information. Don't highlight endlessly. Don't copy notes you don't understand. Instead, test yourself. Try to explain it. Find what confuses you and focus there. Even if you're not naturally curious about the material, you can use techniques that work with your brain rather than against it. But third, and most important, most learning in life is optional. People don't realize this. After formal education ends, you get to choose what you learn. And even during formal education, there's enormous room for following your own interests within and beyond the curriculum. The real issue is that many people have learned to suppress their curiosity so thoroughly that they don't even know what they're interested in anymore. They've learned to think of learning as a chore, as something done for external reasons, to get a grade, to get a job. to meet a requirement. But curiosity is still there. It's waiting. Ask someone about a topic they find fascinating and watch what happens. Their whole demeanor changes. They lean forward. They speak faster. Their eyes light up. They want to share what they understand, to explore what they don't yet understand. That's the natural state. That's what learning looks like when it's working right. So if learning feels like pulling teeth, if it's exhausting and unrewarding, that's not a sign that you're bad at learning. It's a sign that you're approaching it wrong. You're trying to force-feed yourself information your brain has no particular reason to want. The solution isn't to try harder with the same approach. It's to change the approach, to start with questions you actually have, to follow your genuine curiosity, to learn because you want to understand, not because you're supposed to know. When you do this, learning transforms. It becomes something you look forward to rather than something you have to make yourself do. Understanding becomes its own reward. The process becomes enjoyable. And here's the beautiful irony. When learning becomes enjoyable, when you're following genuine curiosity, you actually learn more. You understand more deeply. You retain information better. You make more connections. Not because you're trying harder, but because you're working with your brain's natural mechanisms rather than against them. The 3-year-old asking why about everything isn't working hard at learning. They're just curious. And in a few short years, driven purely by that curiosity, they'll master language, develop sophisticated reasoning, build complex models of how the world works, all without textbooks, without tests, without anyone making them study. That capacity doesn't go away as you get older. It just gets buried under expectations, under obligations, under the accumulated weight of years of being told what to learn and how to learn it. But it's still there, still waiting, still ready to make learning what it should be. Not a chore, not an obligation, but a natural expression of the simple fact that the human brain wants to understand the world. The question isn't whether you can enjoy learning. The question is whether you're willing to learn the way your brain actually wants to learn, starting with curiosity, following questions, seeking understanding, rather than the way you were taught that learning is supposed to happen. If you're not enjoying learning, you're not doing it wrong because you lack discipline or intelligence. You're doing it wrong because you're using the wrong mechanism. You're trying to force something that works better when you let it flow naturally. The solution is simpler than you think. Find something you're genuinely curious about. Start there. Follow the questions that emerge. Let understanding build naturally. And notice how different it feels when learning is something you want to do rather than something you have to do. That's not a trick or a technique. That's just learning the way it's meant to work.
Imagine for a moment that genius isn't a type of person, but a way of thinking. Many people believe they were born with a brain bad at learning, as if the mind came with a permanent factory label. But that's just the snapshot of a brain that got used to working in only one way, usually a lazy, automatic way, untrained for deep thinking. The good news? The brain is plastic, highly plastic, a living muscle that reorganizes itself when we demand more from it. Neuroplasticity, that elegant word that sounds like it came from a futuristic lab, basically says, if you train me, I change. It doesn't matter your age, academic history, or how many traumatic report cards you have from the past. The mind learns to learn, and that means intelligence, focus, and depth aren't destiny, they're practice. But here's a detail almost no one tells you. Reprogramming the way you think takes time, months, maybe years. But the difference is, when it changes, it really changes. And that's what transforms someone ordinary into the type of person who understands quickly, connects ideas, solves problems, and learns without suffering. To start, we need to answer, what exactly makes someone seem like a genius? Usually, 2 things stand out. Off-the-charts memory. It's not magic. It's the result of how information was encoded the first time. A bad memory almost always comes from a bad first contact. Deep understanding. The ability to take an idea and work with it like it's clay, twist it, compare it, test it, apply it, transform it. The combination of these 2 factors creates the myth of the genius. But behind the myth, there's only method, and method can be learned. Now get ready, because we're going to dive into the internal engineering of this so-called deep understanding and reveal why most people don't think, they just repeat. Most people believe they've understood something simply because they recognized the words. But recognizing isn't understanding. It's just familiarity disguised as intelligence. The brain loves this trick. It shows you information. You think, oh, I know this, and boom. The mind closes the book before even really opening it. It's like seeing the cover of an airplane manual and thinking you can already fly. This kind of superficial thinking creates an illusion of knowledge that, deep down, prevents real learning. Deep understanding is born when you force your mind to explain, not just repeat. This is where the game changes. Explaining is dismantling an idea and reassembling it with your own pieces. It's transforming information into structure. When you explain something in your own words, the mind is forced to use real cognitive energy, and this activates the neural networks that consolidate memory, reasoning, and clarity. It's like switching from a weak flashlight to a spotlight. You see angles that weren't visible before. But there's another extremely dangerous cognitive trap: automatic thinking. The brain loves shortcuts because they save energy, but mental shortcuts are like trying to learn math using only magic tricks. They seem to work for a while until you encounter a real problem and everything collapses. Thinking deeply requires effort and slowing down. It's the moment when you tell your brain, "Hold on, let's understand this properly," and that's when the miracle begins. But effort alone isn't enough. You need to ask the right question. The question that activates insight, the question that forces your brain to leave the surface. And that question is simple. Why is this true? This has been found repeatedly in studies on learning and appears as a critical mechanism for converting curiosity into solid understanding. When you ask why, your mind is pushed into the internal engineering of the idea. It's like opening the box and looking at the engine inside. You separate cause and effect, understand relationships, identify what matters, and discard what doesn't. It's a type of thinking that transforms an average student into someone capable of creating, improvising, and innovating. Another powerful practice is testing whether you really understood something by trying to apply it in a different context. If the idea only works in the original example, you memorized, you didn't learn. But if you can move the concept to another scenario, twist it a bit, adapt it, play with it, then your mind starts operating in genius mode. And here comes an important, almost amusing detail. The brain doesn't like to think deeply, but it loves the feeling of having understood something deeply. It's like climbing a mountain, tiring during, satisfying after. The difference is that when you really think, this after transforms everything. Memory improves, focus improves, reasoning improves, even your confidence changes. Now that you understand the danger of automatic thinking and the power of explaining, asking, and applying, let's move to the next layer: how to transform curiosity into a permanent learning engine. Curiosity isn't just a pleasant feeling, it's a biological force, a survival mechanism that pushes the brain to solve mysteries. But there's a secret here. Curiosity doesn't arise from what you already know, but from what you almost know. The mind gets hooked when it perceives a small gap, something within your reach but still outside your domain. It's the famous, "I almost got it." This gray zone is the spark that transforms interest into deep attention. And here's the crucial point. You can create this spark deliberately. How? By asking questions that create cognitive tension. Not anxiety, but that slight discomfort that makes the brain want to complete a pattern. Questions like, what am I missing? Which part of this still doesn't make sense? Or, if this were false, why would it be? Push your mind into an activity it normally avoids. Real investigation. When you investigate, the brain lights up areas connected to motivation, memory, and reward, and learning accelerates. But there's something even more interesting. Curiosity multiplies when you transform knowledge into a mental game. For example, trying to predict the next part of a concept before reading it, or trying to answer a question before seeing the answer. Neuroscience shows that when you try to guess something, even if you're wrong, your brain activates learning areas much more strongly than when you just receive information ready-made. Mistakes, in fact, are fuel for sophisticated learning. They create contrast, and contrast creates clarity. Another essential aspect is allowing yourself to play with ideas. Many people think serious reasoning requires rigidity, but the greatest insights come when you allow your mind to make unlikely connections. Playing intellectually is an elegant way of telling the brain, look for new patterns, and when it looks, it finds. But this play has one rule. You need to feel free to make mistakes. Without this freedom, the brain becomes defensive, rigid, trying to seem right instead of trying to understand. And here's the key that transforms curiosity into permanent skill. You must learn to fall in love with the question, not the answer. Answers are static. Questions are expansive. When you cultivate good questions, you create an internal engine that keeps running even after the video, class, or conversation ends. This is how genius minds operate. They don't accumulate answers. They manufacture irresistible questions. Now that you understand how to activate curiosity and convert it into real learning, we're ready to enter the region where genius really begins. The brain doesn't learn in large blocks. It learns in strategic fragments. The human mind wasn't made to absorb large blocks of information at once. It was made to break the world into small, manageable, meaningful pieces. When you try to learn something huge all at once, your brain goes into protection mode. It freezes, disperses, pushes everything away. But when you present content in smart fragments, almost like puzzle pieces, the brain does exactly the opposite. It approaches, organizes, and connects. Imagine this. Each piece of information is like a knot. The brain doesn't want to keep loose knots. It wants to tie them to each other to form a network. The more connections, the stronger the learning. That's why a powerful secret for training your mind like a brilliant mind is to fragment ideas until they become inevitable. When something is inevitable, the brain doesn't fight, it accepts.
This is where an elegant technique comes in, the micro-block method.
Instead of studying for 1 hour, you study for 5 minutes, but 5 minutes with intensity, clarity, and absolute focus on just one point. In this microblock, you ask yourself, what's the essence? And what does this really mean? 5 well-used minutes are worth more than 50 poorly distributed minutes. The brain learns in focus, not in brute effort. Another essential principle is repetition with variation. Repeating exactly the same is boring for the brain, and everything boring gets erased. But when you repeat an idea by slightly changing the context, the brain registers it as something alive, relevant, applicable. That's why great masters explain the same thing in multiple ways. They don't repeat because they forgot. They repeat because they want you to remember. And here's a powerful image. Learning is like illuminating a dark room with a flashlight. With each small sweep of light, you see more details. You don't turn on all the lights at once. You explore. Genius is in the movement, not in the volume. Finally, there's a serious mistake that prevents thousands of people from learning well. They try to memorize before understanding. It's like trying to build walls without a foundation. When you understand, memory forms naturally. When you memorize, it evaporates. The right fragment, repeated the right way, with active curiosity, creates a mind that doesn't just learn, but transforms what it learns into powerful clarity. And now we're ready to explore something deep. How to transform this knowledge into real reasoning. The kind of thinking that solves problems, creates ideas, and sees patterns invisible to most. Reasoning well isn't thinking more, it's thinking better. Most people think intelligence is a brute force of the mind, a kind of hidden muscle. But truly powerful thinking doesn't come from effort. It comes from internal organization. A trained mind doesn't desperately chase answers. It creates pathways. Imagine that each problem is a closed box. The common mind tries to break open the box. The brilliant mind first tries to understand the shape of the lock. It doesn't waste energy, it directs energy. And reasoning is that, direction. One of the most elegant principles for training this kind of thinking is the mother question technique. Every complex question can be reduced to a simple question that organizes the chaos. You ask questions like, what's really happening here? What's the essential part of this? What do I need to ignore to understand? The mind gains clarity not when it adds more information, but when it removes noise. Another fundamental point, you only truly understand something when you can explain it with simple words. Not simple because you're limited, simple because you're deep. Complication is a disguise for confusion. Simplicity is the mark of comprehension. When your brain translates an idea to its most essential form, it's as if it's drawing an internal map. and a clear map is always more useful than a foggy landscape. Here's a powerful analogy. Thinking is like tuning an instrument. If you tune string by string, sound by sound, the music flows. If you try to play with everything out of tune, it becomes noise. So whenever your mind gets stuck, stop and tune a single string. Redefine focus. Formulate a central question. Eliminate an irrelevant detail. A tuned mind produces insights with little effort, almost as if it's hearing the answer instead of manufacturing it. And there's still a secret that few understand. Thinking is a physical art. Ideas only align when you get them out of your head. Speak out loud, draw, write scribbles, trace arrows. The mind is brilliant, but it's a terrible place to store loose thoughts. When you externalize, the brain frees up space and starts to see invisible relationships. Insight comes because you gave it space to be born. When you master this way of thinking, something powerful happens. Problems stop being monsters and become mechanisms. And when you understand the mechanism, you control the outcome. Now that you master clarity, let's advance to an even more sophisticated point. How to transform knowledge and reasoning into real creativity. That rare ability to see solutions where no one else is looking. Creativity isn't a magical talent reserved for geniuses. It's a specific way of combining information. The common mind looks for answers within the obvious. The creative mind takes pieces no one imagined together and builds something new. And when you learn this process, your mind starts producing ideas like breathing.
The first key to creativity is accepting a simple fact. Your mind hates empty, so it fills spaces. If you create the right space, it fills with solutions. But if you live squeezed by anxiety, haste, and excess stimulation, it only fills with noise. Creativity is silence where a flash is. That's why moments of pause, shower, walk, coffee, looking out the window are hidden laboratories of the brain. While you think you're not thinking, your mind is connecting wires that were previously separate. But it's not enough to wait for the flash. Creative insight is an active process, almost engineering. First you collect pieces, then you dismantle, then you recombine. A simple and powerful way to do this is to ask, what if I do the opposite? What if this works without this part? What element can I steal from another area and put here? The world's most creative minds don't invent from scratch. They transplant ideas. And here comes one of the most elegant techniques for training the mind like a genius: cognitive contrast. When you compare two distant ideas, physics and cooking, music and math, art and engineering, your mind creates bridges. And it's on these bridges that unique solutions are born. The more varied your repertoire, the more powerful your capacity for invention. A narrow mind creates little. A broad mind creates world. There's also an essential detail that almost no one understands. Creativity requires courage. Yes, courage, because every new idea seems silly before it seems brilliant. And whoever fears embarrassment never accesses their true creative potential. Fear blocks the flow. Curiosity releases it. The creative mind is the mind that allows itself to fail fast, test fast, adjust fast. Creating is playing with the unknown until it becomes familiar. And the most beautiful point of all, creativity isn't about being different. It's about being perceptibly useful. A genius idea isn't the most exotic. It's the one that solves something elegantly. Creativity is functional aesthetics. It's when the solution is so good it seems simple. But it only seems that way because you did the hard work of really thinking. Now that you master reasoning and creativity, let's enter the territory that separates common minds from extraordinary minds. How to transform knowledge, clarity, and creativity into real skill. The ability to learn anything quickly. Learning fast isn't a gift, it's method. And the method starts with a simple question that almost no one has the courage to ask. What exactly didn't I understand? It seems obvious, but observe. Most people fake comprehension to protect the ego, when precisely the act of admitting failure is what opens space for real understanding. The mind that learns isn't the one that seems intelligent, but the one that allows itself to investigate without shame. Accelerated learning works like assembling a puzzle. You don't need all the pieces to see the image, just the right pieces. That's why the trick is to locate the key points, the invisible structures that support everything else. When you understand the mechanism behind the phenomenon, you learn 10 times faster. It's like discovering the magician's trick. After you see it, you never unsee it. And here's a detail that changes everything. Asking is smarter than answering. Each well-made question stretches the brain, forces clarity, and reveals shortcuts. So think now. Really think. What subject in your life haven't you mastered yet because you never asked the right question about it? Hold that reflection for a moment.
The ability to learn also depends on the skill of breaking complex subjects into smaller, chewable blocks. The most common mistake is trying to understand everything at once and drowning the brain. Don't do that. Instead ask, what's the smallest part of this I can understand now, and then build on top. A brilliant mind doesn't run, it stacks. But none of this works if you don't apply the maximum rule of learning. Teach to understand. When you explain something in your own words, the brain is forced to organize the idea, detect holes, correct flaws. Each explanation is a workout. Each explanation makes you sharper. The more you teach, the more you learn, even if no one's listening. Now, I want you to do something for yourself. What skill have you been postponing learning because it seems too difficult? Write it in the comments. Yes, write it. I read all of them. Absolutely all of them. And if you leave your difficulty there, I can help you dismantle that skill into simple, clear steps that finally make sense. Because the truth is this, the distance between you and your next great competency isn't talent, it's method, and you're learning the method. By this point, you've realized an exceptional mind isn't born ready. It's built, piece by piece, decision by decision. And the most interesting thing is that after you change the way you think, the world starts to change with it. Not because it got easier, but because you got clearer, sharper, more capable. The brain loves whoever challenges it with kindness, loves when you ask better questions, loves when you break big problems into small parts, loves when you explain something out loud as if illuminating your own darkness. That's the real training. That's the secret that separates those who want to learn from those who actually learn. And if you got this far, that already says something powerful about you. Your mind wants to grow. And when a mind wants to grow, nothing holds it back. Now I want to make you a direct invitation. What was the biggest insight you had today? Write it in the comments. I read all of them, and I respond whenever I can. Sometimes a single sentence from you gives me the chance to guide you on the right path. If this video helped you, provoked you, or made you think, then do this now. Like the video, because this takes this message to other people who need it as much as you do. And if you want to continue training your mind with me, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, each video is designed to expand your thinking, accelerate your learning, and bring you closer to your best version. Not the perfect version, but the possible version, built day after day. Thank you for being here. Now go out there and use your mind, not as a spectator, but as the author of your own thinking. See you in the next video.
Let me be honest with you. You think you understand things, but most of what you carry in your head is just labels, words. They sound impressive. They shut down questions. They give authority without earning it. But if you strip the language away and nothing meaningful remains, then the understanding was never there. It was decoration, a costume worn by ignorance to look intelligent. Here's the uncomfortable part. Most education systems reward this behavior. You're taught to recognize the right answers, not to wrestle with the problems. You're trained to pass tests, not to challenge assumptions. So you grow up believing that knowing the correct terminology means you know the subject. It doesn't. It just means you've been exposed to it. Real understanding begins where memorization fails. It begins the moment you ask a question that doesn't have a clean answer. It begins when you try to explain an idea in simple terms and realize you can't. That moment of failure is not a sign that you're stupid. It's proof that you're finally touching the edge of what you don't know. And that edge is where thinking actually starts. The mind loves certainty because certainty feels safe. But certainty is often a shortcut, a way to stop investigating. The moment you become emotionally attached to an explanation, you stop testing it. You defend it instead. You look for agreement rather than evidence. And slowly, without noticing, curiosity is replaced by belief. Belief is easy. Understanding is hard. Understanding demands humility. It requires you to accept that your current explanation might be incomplete or wrong or useful only in limited situations. It forces you to separate what you wish were true from what actually survives contact with reality. That process is uncomfortable, which is why so few people commit to it. Instead, they lean on authority. Someone famous said it. A book stated it. A teacher explained it. That may be a starting point, but it is never the finish line. Reality does not recognize credentials. It only responds to accurate descriptions. If two explanations compete, the one that predicts outcomes more reliably wins. Not because it sounds better, not because it's older, not because more people repeat it, but because it works. That's the only standard that matters. And this is where most people quietly fail. They never test their understanding. They never ask what would happen if this were wrong. They never try to break their own ideas. They protect them, they decorate them, they repeat them louder. But ideas don't become stronger through protection. They become stronger through pressure. If you can't explain an idea without hiding behind jargon, you don't own it. If you can't answer basic questions without getting defensive, you don't understand it. And if you can't admit uncertainty, you've already stopped learning. The goal is not to sound intelligent. That's a shallow ambition. The goal is to see more clearly. And clarity often looks simple, even obvious, once you finally reach it. Not because it was easy, but because confusion has been removed. So here is the challenge you should carry with you. Whenever you learn a new concept, strip the words away and ask what remains. Ask what it explains, what it predicts, what it fails to explain. Ask where it breaks. Ask how you would know if it were wrong. Do this consistently, and your confidence will shrink, but your understanding will grow. You'll speak less, you'll listen more. You'll be slower to declare certainty and faster to ask better questions. That's not weakness. That's intellectual strength. Because the person who knows the limits of their understanding is far more dangerous, in the best possible way, than the person who merely knows the right words. And until you learn that difference, you don't understand reality. You just recognize its names. Certainty is often the enemy of truth because the moment you become absolutely sure, you stop looking. You close the door, not because you've reached the end of understanding, but because certainty feels comfortable. It gives the mind a place to rest. And when the mind rests, inquiry dies. Truth is not offended by questions. False ideas are. That alone should make you suspicious of anything that demands loyalty instead of examination. Real understanding invites pressure. It survives doubt. It improves when challenged, but certainty behaves differently. It protects itself. It resists testing. It treats questions as threats rather than tools. Most people don't realize when certainty takes over because it disguises itself as confidence. Confidence sounds strong. It feels decisive. It's rewarded socially. But confidence without continuous testing is just frozen thinking. It's an opinion that stopped evolving. The world does not work that way. Reality keeps changing, or at least revealing new layers of itself. Explanations that once worked may fail under new conditions. Ideas that were useful approximations can become misleading if treated as absolute. Truth is not a trophy you win once and keep forever. It's a process, an ongoing conversation with reality. Certainty interrupts that conversation. When you're certain, you stop asking why and start saying because. You stop listening for signals that contradict you. You reinterpret evidence to protect your belief instead of adjusting your belief to fit the evidence. That's not understanding, that's maintenance. And the most dangerous certainty is not loud arrogance. It's quiet confidence, the kind that never feels the need to question itself, the kind that says this is how it is and moves on. That mindset blocks discovery not by force but by satisfaction. History is full of ideas that were once held with absolute certainty and later collapsed under simple observation. They didn't fall because people were stupid. They fell because people were convinced they were finished thinking. Every major correction in human understanding began with someone saying, "I'm not convinced," or "something doesn't fit." Those statements don't come from certainty. They come from doubt. Doubt is not the opposite of knowledge, it's the engine of it. Doubt creates movement. It keeps ideas flexible. It allows you to hold explanations lightly, ready to replace them when better ones appear. Without doubt, learning becomes memorization and progress becomes repetition. But doubt is uncomfortable. It leaves questions open. It resists closure. That's why certainty is attractive. It offers psychological relief. It lets you stop struggling with uncertainty and declare victory. The problem is, truth doesn't care about your comfort. Nature doesn't adjust itself to match your beliefs. It doesn't reward conviction. It rewards accuracy. And accuracy requires constant adjustment. The moment you believe your explanation is final, you stop making those adjustments. This is why the smartest thinkers are often the least certain, not because they know less, but because they see more. They recognize the gaps. They understand the assumptions hidden inside their explanations. They know where their models work, and where they don't say, this is the truth. They say, this works so far. That small difference changes everything. Certainty turns ideas into identities. Once that happens, questioning the idea feels like a personal attack. Evidence becomes an enemy. Criticism becomes disrespect. And truth becomes secondary to self-protection. At that point, learning is no longer the goal. Winning arguments has nothing to do with understanding reality. If you want to get closer to truth, you have to make peace with uncertainty. You have to accept that your current understanding is provisional, useful perhaps, effective maybe, but never final. That doesn't mean you drift without conclusions. It means you hold conclusions with humility. You use them, test them, and remain willing to abandon them when they fail. Certainty shuts down that flexibility. It replaces curiosity with defense. It trades exploration for stability. And while stability feels good, it quietly erodes the very thing that led you to understanding in the first place. So the real danger of certainty is not that it's wrong. It's that it prevents you from discovering when it is. The truth does not require you to believe in it. It requires you to keep checking. Authority does not equal correctness, and confusing the two is one of the fastest ways to stop thinking. The moment a statement is accepted because of who said it rather than why it works, understanding takes a back seat. Titles replace testing. Reputation replaces reasoning. And slowly, without noticing, judgment is outsourced. Authority feels efficient. It saves time. You don't have to struggle through uncertainty or verify claims yourself if someone important has already spoken. That shortcut is tempting, especially in complex subjects where the effort required to check things feels overwhelming. But convenience is not truth, and mental laziness has never produced. Insight, reality does not recognize rank. It doesn't care about degrees, awards, or confidence. If an explanation is wrong, it will fail no matter who proposed it. If it's right, it will work even if it came from an unknown voice. Nature does not negotiate with authority. The danger begins when respect turns into obedience. Respect is reasonable. You listen carefully to people with experience. You consider their ideas seriously. Obedience is different. Obedience means suspending your own judgment. It means accepting conclusions without understanding the reasoning behind them. That's not learning, that's submission. Many people mistake disagreement with disrespect. They think questioning an expert is arrogance. It's not. Refusing to question is negligence. If an idea is solid, it will survive scrutiny. If it collapses when questioned, authority was the only thing holding it up. History is a record of authoritative certainty being corrected by careful doubt. For long periods, confident experts were wrong, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they trusted established answers more than observed reality. Progress didn't come from louder credentials. It came from people willing to check. Authority tends to protect itself. Once a system of ideas becomes institutionalized, challenges are treated as threats rather than opportunities. Dissenters are dismissed, not evaluated. But truth doesn't advance by consensus. It advances by correction. The most reliable thinkers understand this. They don't ask who said it. First, they ask, how do we know? They care less about pedigree and more about evidence. They don't reject authority automatically, but they never surrender to it either. Blind trust creates fragile knowledge. It works only as long as no one tests it. The moment reality pushes back, the cracks appear. And when that happens, people who relied on authority instead of understanding are left confused, angry, or defensive. Understanding requires ownership. You must be able to trace an idea back to its foundations, see its assumptions, and recognize its limits. If you can't do that, then the idea isn't really yours. You're carrying it for someone else. This is why authority should guide curiosity, not replace it. Experts can point you toward useful questions, proven methods, and past failures, but they cannot think for you. The moment they do, learning stops. There is also a subtle arrogance hidden in blind obedience. It's the belief that someone else has already done all the necessary thinking, so you don't have to. That assumption is not humility, it's avoidance. True humility is acknowledging that no one is infallible, including the most respected voices in the room. It's recognizing that expertise increases reliability, not certainty. Even the best explanations are approximations, waiting to be improved or replaced. Authority becomes dangerous when it is treated as a shield against criticism. When someone says, "Trust me," instead of showing their reasoning, that's a warning sign. Truth does not need protection from questions. If you want to get closer to reality, learn to separate respect from acceptance. Listen carefully. Examine thoroughly. Agree conditionally. Disagree respectfully. And always reserve the right to change your mind. Because the moment you stop questioning authority, you stop participating in the search for truth. You become a spectator in someone else's understanding. And reality will eventually remind you that it never asked who was in charge. Questions are more valuable than answers because answers have an expiration date and questions do not. An answer can feel solid, complete, and satisfying, but that feeling is often an illusion. It gives the mind closure, and closure is where curiosity quietly dies. A good question, on the other hand, refuses to let you rest. It keeps pulling at the loose threads of your understanding. It exposes gaps you didn't know were there. And that discomfort is not a flaw, it's the signal that real thinking has begun. Answers are attractive because they feel like progress. You ask something, you receive a response, and your brain registers completion. But most answers are temporary solutions to deeper problems. They work within a limited context under certain assumptions at a particular level of detail. Treat them as final and they become obstacles. They stop you from noticing when conditions change or when the explanation no longer fits reality. A question does the opposite. It keeps the system open. When you ask a serious question, you are admitting that your current understanding is incomplete. That admission is powerful. It creates space for learning. It allows new information to enter without being filtered through the need to be right. A question doesn't demand loyalty, it demands exploration. Most people are trained to value answers early in life. School rewards correct responses, not interesting questions. Exams measure how well you can reproduce what's already known, not how deeply you can interrogate it. Over time, this trains the mind to chase closure instead of clarity. The habit becomes automatic. Get the answer, move on. But moving on too quickly is how shallow understanding survives. An answer can stop a conversation. A question can open 10 new ones. That's why progress, real progress, comes from questioning what seems obvious. Every major shift in understanding started with someone refusing to accept an answer that everyone else was comfortable with. Not because they wanted to be difficult, but because something didn't sit right. Questions are dangerous to weak ideas. That's precisely why they matter. If an explanation collapses under a simple question, it was never strong to begin with. Strong ideas don't fear questions, they depend on them. Each challenge refines them, sharpens their boundaries, reveals their limits. Without questions, ideas stagnate. They become slogans rather than two. Answers often create the illusion of mastery. You hear an explanation, you can repeat it, and suddenly you feel informed. But repetition is not understanding. Understanding shows itself when you can navigate unfamiliar situations, when you can predict outcomes, when you can recognize where an explanation applies and where it fails. Questions train that ability. Answers alone do not. There is also a deeper reason questions matter more. They keep you honest. An answer can be memorized without being examined. A question forces engagement. It requires you to confront uncertainty directly. It exposes how much of your confidence is borrowed. When you can't answer your own question, you are faced with a choice. Pretend you understand or admit that you don't. That moment separates performance from thinking. Most people choose performance. They collect answers like trophies. They quote them, defend them, build identities around them. And once an answer becomes part of who you are, questioning it feels like self-destruction. At that point, learning stops, not because there is nothing left to learn, but because curiosity has been sacrificed to self-protection. Questions don't let you hide that way. They strip away certainty. They force humility. They remind you that understanding is provisional, that explanations are tools, not truths carved into reality. This doesn't mean answers are useless. They are necessary. But they are not the destination. They are checkpoints, temporary resting places before the next question appears. The mistake is treating them as final. A mind focused on answers asks, what is the correct response? A mind focused on questions asks, what's really going on here? That difference changes everything. When you value questions, you listen differently. You notice inconsistencies. You pay attention to what doesn't fit. You become comfortable saying, I don't know yet, without feeling diminished by it. That comfort is not ignorance, it's intellectual maturity. The most dangerous phrase in thinking is that's settled. Nothing important ever truly is. Reality is too complex, too layered, too subtle for permanent closure. Every explanation is an approximation. Every model leaves something out. Questions keep those limitations visible. Without questions, answers harden into dogma. With questions, answers remain flexible, useful, and alive. So if you want depth, stop chasing closure. Stop collecting conclusions as if they were proof of intelligence. Start cultivating questions that make you uneasy, questions that challenge what you think you already know, questions that don't resolve quickly because answers may make you sound informed, but questions are what actually move you closer to understanding. If you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it, and no amount of confidence, credentials, or complex language will change that. Complexity is often mistaken for depth, but more often than not, it's camouflage. It hid. There's gaps in understanding behind impressive words and long explanations that sound intelligent while saying very little. When someone truly understands something, they don't need to protect it with confusion. They can walk straight through it, clearly, step by step, without getting lost. Simplicity is not about dumbing things down. It's about stripping an idea to its core and seeing what actually holds it together. That process is brutally honest. It exposes every weak assumption, every borrowed explanation, every place where you've been pretending to understand instead of actually thinking. That's why people avoid it. It's far easier to repeat a complicated explanation than to build a simple one from scratch. When you explain something simply, you are forced to confront reality. You can't hide behind jargon. You can't lean on authority. You can't say, it just works that way and move on. You have to answer basic questions. What is happening? Why does it happen? What would happen if it didn't? Those questions are unforgiving. They don't care how educated you are. They don't care how many books you've read. They only care whether your explanation actually makes sense. Most people don't fail at understanding because the subject is too hard. They fail because they stop at the first explanation that sounds reasonable. They accept a description instead of building a mental model. They memorize conclusions without understanding the machinery underneath. As long as the explanation feels satisfying, they move on. That satisfaction is the trap. Real understanding feels different. It's quiet. It's precise. It allows you to predict outcomes and recognize when something doesn't fit. And it gives you the ability to explain the idea to someone else without relying on borrowed language. If you can't do that, you don't own the idea, you're renting it. Simple explanations are difficult because they require you to know what matters and what doesn't. They force you to distinguish the essential from the decorative. That takes work. It requires you to rethink the idea multiple times, each time removing unnecessary parts until only the structure remains. That structure is understanding. People often confuse simplicity with incompleteness. They think that a simple explanation must be missing something. Sometimes it is, but often what's missing is not truth, it's clutter. The mind loves clutter because it feels like progress. More details, more terms, more layers. But progress is not measured by how much you can say. It's measured by how clearly you can see. When an explanation is truly understood, it becomes flexible. You can approach it from different angles. You can explain it to different audiences. You can adjust it when new evidence appears. That flexibility comes from simplicity. Complex, fragile explanations break the moment conditions change. Simple ones adapt. There's another uncomfortable reason people avoid simple explanations. Simplicity makes you accountable. If your explanation is clear, it can be tested. It can be challenged. Others can see exactly where it might fail. Complexity offers protection. It creates fog. In fog, mistakes are harder to spot. That's why simple explanations are often resisted, especially in intellectual environments. They threaten status. They remove the mystery that makes some people feel important. If everyone can understand the idea, then expertise has to be earned through accuracy, not presentation. Understanding something simply doesn't mean you ignore its depth. It means you understand the foundation well enough to build on it. Depth without clarity is not depth. It's confusion stacked on top of confusion. Clarity comes first. Complexity, when necessary, comes later. When you hear an explanation that leaves you more confused than when you started, don't assume the subject is too advanced. Consider the possibility that the explanation is bad. A good explanation increases understanding. It doesn't demand patience or faith. It earns trust by making sense. The discipline of simple explanation is a constant test. It forces you to revisit ideas you thought you understood and ask whether you really do. It exposes intellectual laziness. It separates genuine comprehension from polished repetition. If you want to know whether you understand something, try to explain it without notes, without jargon, and without rushing. If you get stuck, that's not a failure. That's feedback. It's telling you exactly where your understanding ends. And that's valuable information. Because understanding doesn't grow from pretending. It grows from identifying what you don't yet know and working patiently toward clarity. Simplicity is not the end of thinking. It's the proof that thinking is